Now, please welcome your hosts, Kathleen Merrigan, Dean and Director of Land Grant Programs for the College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability, and Environmental Sciences at the University of the District of Columbia, Sabine O'Hara, C.S. Mott Chair of Sustainable Agriculture at Michigan State University, Michael Hamm, and Executive Director of AGREE, Deborah Atwood.
Okay, good morning again. So I'm going to start off with a few logistics. That's my job. So, well, let's start with the nice logistics. I want to put out a few thank yous because when you put something like this together, it's a lot of behind-the-scenes work. I want to thank our volunteers, most of whom are students here. So if you need anything throughout the day, they're the people who have the gray T-shirts that say GW Food Institute. Reach out to any of them for anything, and they'll make sure to help in whatever way you need. I want to thank the Jack Morton Auditorium staff. This is a beautiful auditorium. They run things so well here. You might say, what a beautiful stage. This was originally designed for Crossfire. So it's got that TV feel to it, and we love being able to use it. I want to thank Sweet Green, who is sponsoring this conference, and I think will be sharing lunch with us today, and I'm looking forward to that. 11th Hour Project, which is a core funder of the Food Institute at GW. Grateful for them. Some of my staff, Kyle McGowan, who's my executive assistant, always the backbone of the operations. Kayla Williams is a student who's worked on this all summer, among others. But most importantly, Ariel Kagan, who is a wonderful person, and this is her baby, this symposium, so we thank her. I also want to thank Jose Andres. Steve Knapp mentioned him, famous chef. He is really the person propelling our work here at the GW Food Institute. He's a colleague of mine. When we teach in the spring, we teach a class called The Sustainable Plate. We have an awful lot of fun together, and aren't our GW students so lucky to have him in our midst? So we do have a GW Food Institute. That's where this is being live streamed from, our website, foodinstitute.gwu.edu. So I want to say hello to the live stream audience. We have people out there everywhere, I suppose, tuning in, and we welcome you, and we want to engage you throughout the day. Let me see in my other cards. Okay, so we have breakfast upstairs on the second floor. That service is going to be going all morning, so if you need to take a stretch, you can go up there, or you need to talk to a colleague. There's screens up there. You can watch the proceedings from the second floor as well. We don't have a formal break throughout the morning, in part because we have a live stream going on, but we will have one of our GW exercise science students coming in and leading us in a little yoga stretch at a midpoint in the morning. And then finally, we have an innovative tool that we're using, for me the first time, Pigeonhole, to have conversation with you all in the room and people out there in cyberspace, a mechanism to allow you to submit your questions. Now, if you didn't get this coming in, you can grab one out there on the table. It gives the instructions for Pigeonhole and also how to get it on Wi-Fi here in the room. But if you can, pull out your phones, pull out your computers, and let's just do a trial run to see how Pigeonhole works, so that we're getting you going. You know, you've had a little caffeine this morning, we'll see how it is. And I think the slides are gonna come up, and the question we're gonna ask you is, if you go into Pigeonhole, and everyone's scrambling to find their phone, including my colleagues, I didn't even try to bring mine on stage, you're very brave. We wanna find out what your favorite season of the year is. So you have easy 4 choices: spring, summer, fall, winter. And today's just dreary. I don't know if that's a season for those of us in DC. But try it out, and let me see. I think that they're going to pull it up on the screen in a minute when everybody finishes voting. And those of you out there in cyberspace, you're voting too. It's not just the people here in the room. Ah, there we go. Look at, we can watch it. Huh. Fall is dominant. Oh, summer's pulling in. Spring. I'm telling you, winter's really, okay, winter's not doing so well. Interesting.
Come on.
Yeah, spring and summer need to team up.
Okay, my vote's in. There, spring is.
All right, so I'm gonna call it in time, but now you're seeing how that pigeonhole technology works for those of you inside this auditorium and those of you in cyberspace. And I'm glad to see that fall is the winner because we are now in fall. And to me, that's the best season too, because for me, it's the beginning of the academic year. New beginnings are always exciting. So welcome to our Urban Agriculture Symposium. We have a lot to talk about today. I do want to preface a little bit about why we're doing this Urban Ag Symposium. I spent Saturday driving in rural western Wisconsin. And for me, it was just so reinvigorating because I grew up in rural community, in rural America. And those are the kind of landscapes that this body craves. I just sort of get relaxed when I go out there and see all the fields of corn, and I see the cows grazing and all of that sort of thing. That's my world. But as Steve Knapp said, we're increasingly urbanizing. And I wonder how people even connect to what's going on out there in the rural countryside. And one of the things when I was deputy secretary at USDA I worked really hard on was this know your farmer, know your food. And that was trying to reconnect people with how food is grown, who grows it, and why it's important. Since I've been here at GW in the middle of the city, I've noticed across the country there's more and more innovative stuff going on in urban agriculture. Now this is newfangled stuff for me. I'm going to learn a lot today. But part of what we want to accomplish is get a little sense of what's going on, hear a lot of different ideas. This is not trying to come to consensus viewpoint on any particular thing today. But there's growing interest, growing investment, growing excitement over urban agriculture. And we have a farm bill looming. Now, some of you may be new to farm bill politics. Some of us are old to it. There is on Pigeonhole a little background or paper that the Congressional Research Service wrote on what is a farm bill, if this is something new to you. But every 5 years or so, Congress writes this big omnibus piece of legislation called a farm bill. The next reauthorization date is expected to be 2018, though some people are saying maybe it'll even be earlier because the dairy sector is not doing so well. The margin protection program that's set up is not satisfying for most of dairy states. And so maybe it would even go faster. And we have a couple of members of Congress who we'll be hearing from today, who've been leaders in urban agriculture, introducing legislation around urban agriculture. And we really want to use today to gather up ideas, to gather up visions, to really try to explore the expertises out there to bring all of this into the Farm Bill discussions. So that's my little opener. So with that, I'm going to turn it to, these are my co-hosts. So the four organizations have been working together to organize this symposium, and I really appreciate all the help that I've received. I'm going to start with Michael Ham. Michael, one of the questions that we wrote on the agenda here is urban agriculture just this little kind of niche thing? Is it hobby ag? Could it possibly scale? Why are we even talking about this?
Sure. Good question. And I guess I can start with a simple answer, which is the one I give my students most often, which is it depends. So I think there's two it depends here. One is, I always like to, when you talk about something like scale, I like to get quantitative pretty quickly because at some point, food for people is about tonnage. We consume, if we count everything, all the liquids and everything, coffee, tea, alcohol, all of our food, we consume something like 1,800 pounds a year per person. So that's billions and billions of tons of pounds of food a year across the country. If we take a place like Washington, D.C., with about 700,000 people, and just think about produce, and in 2000, the average American ate about 700 pounds of produce. So in a place like D.C., that's about half a billion pounds of produce a year. So we're talking about a lot of food. So the question of scale becomes relevant pretty quickly. The other thing that I think becomes relevant very quickly is what are our boundaries for urban agriculture? Because I've heard various people working in the realm, everything from Jack Smith, who's since passed on, who founded the Urban Agriculture Network, who considered all of New Jersey urban agriculture because every census tract in New Jersey is urban influenced or metropolitan influenced. But I think for many people, the boundary condition for urban ag per se is, say, the city limits of DC or the city limits of Detroit or the city limits of the 5 boroughs of New York. And that's the way I kind of think of it. But then we've also got peri-urban and near-rural agriculture that comes into the mix when we talk about a food supply for a city region, let's say.
Michael, can you just say that word peri-urban agriculture again? Tell me what that means.
So if we think of, let's take New Jersey. I spent 20 years there at Rutgers University. And we think of New York City. There's a lot of farms that have been preserved of 30, 40, 100, 200 acres that are in places that we think of as suburbs of New York at this point. And so those would be peri-urban farms relative to New York City.
On the periphery.
On the periphery. If we just go out into Virginia, outside of DC, there's a lot of farms that are growing produce that come into farmers markets in Washington, DC and other places in the area. Those are on the periphery of DC and would be considered peri-urban farms. I think for the purposes of our discussion today, we're talking about agriculture that occurs in the urban core, in Washington, D.C., in Detroit, Michigan, in other cities across the country. And so if we think about that, then the question becomes, can it scale? So if we think about 500 million pounds of produce for Washington, D.C., can D.C. urban agriculture scale to reach some significant percentage of that? And I think that's part of the conversation today, is can we do that, and can it be done in a way where people have control over their food supply, where there is where the people who live in the city control the food supply of that city to some extent. So is there food sovereignty? So I think these become real issues that we can discuss today, and I think that's the purpose of the Urban Ag Farm Bill, is to both think about within that urban core itself, can we get to some scaling of food production that is environmentally sustainable as well as socially sustainable? And can we do that in a way that provides good food, good healthy food for people? So the question is, can it scale? The answer is probably, but it's not simple when we start thinking about the quantity of food that people need on an annual basis. I'll start with that.
Thank you. And you mentioned produce, but we actually have a panel later on this afternoon about livestock do's and don'ts in urban centers, because that's starting to emerge.
That's right. It is starting to emerge, and we'll see.
Deb Atwood, so you are the executive director of AGREE, and this is an organization that's trying to build consensus around food and agriculture reform visions for tomorrow. Why are you here, and why do you think this matters?
Great question. When I started off on the journey of having very diverse people in the room talking about the future of food and agriculture, and oh, by the way, full transparency, Kathleen is one of our co-chairs on AGREE, along with Dan Glickman and Jim Mosley, and Emmy Simmons, along with our 45 advisors. And in our dialogue with people like yourselves, not only in rural areas, but in urban areas, we discovered that the desire to talk about urban agriculture as an important contributor to food security became loud and clear. We have an initiative on it. Just in the past 10 years, we've seen growth in people moving to urban areas. 71% of the United States population lives in a city over 50,000 people. What does that mean? Along with that came this very, very loud voice for, I want to know where my food comes from. The local food, know your farmer, know your food, has taken off. There is a movement afoot in urban agriculture that looks at just not the quantity and quality of what we can produce, but it's connecting our school systems, food access, food availability, and education around the STEM courses. How can food and agriculture in the urban setting be part of that network? And it doesn't matter where we go. Even the big retailers will tell you that people are demanding out of the big retail stores that are located in urban areas that people want to know their food and know their farmer. They want to be part of the sustainable urban dialogue.
Excellent. And we're going to hear from an AGREE advisor later this afternoon.
We are, who's actually a land-based urban agriculture producer.
Excellent. Now, Sabine, you are the dean at UDC, and you're just not talking like I am. You're walking. So I think
right.
you have a couple of slides, right?
do.
So if we can run Sabine's slides, there we go.
Yeah, so University of the District of Columbia is the nation's only exclusively urban land-grant university. So you're right, we kind of walk the walk every day, because for us, the land-grant programs really mean that we're in Washington, D.C., in an urban space. And so that really required us to think through, so where are access points where people would get engaged in urban agriculture? So we came up with this concept of our urban food hubs, and they have 4 components. Food production, so introducing people to technology, to methods, how you can grow a lot of food on very small spaces. And so that can take the form of hydroponics, aquaponics, green roofs, green walls, what you might call bio-intensive growing systems, where you co-locate plants in clusters rather than in rows, all kinds of ways to increase yield from very small spaces. But it turns out that most of our urban populations here in DC aren't exactly waking up in the morning and saying, let me figure out how I can learn to do this urban ag thing, right? And we also make the distinction between urban agriculture and gardening, right? To your question of scalability. It's not just a hobby, but the intention is to really make it economically viable. And so the access point usually is food preparation. And what we mean by that second component of the food hub is, how do we prepare food? What do we know about nutritional value? And so I would contradict you a little bit in terms of what the yield question then is. Is it really volume? For us, it's nutritional yield. What's the nutrient density in our food? And what do we grow in urban areas, particularly in our food desert neighborhoods where we know we have nutritional health issues? So the focus really needs to be on nutrient yield, not just on volume. And then the third component is a really interesting one, but I'm an ag economist, so for me that question of food distribution would be a real interesting one, and it's a real conundrum. Because on the one hand, we have the local foods movement, which creates high-end markets, your seasonal restaurants and so forth, which is great for the urban growers because it's part of what makes it economically viable. Also your ethnic crop niches. But when we sell microgreens for $50 a pound, that doesn't exactly help the populations in our food desert neighborhoods, right? They can't make that price point. So how do we bring affordable, high-quality food to neighborhoods where it's most needed? I don't have a solution, but we're exploring those kinds of things, cooperative models, CSA, subsidized models, and so forth. And then the fourth component, really, really important, and a whole other interesting world to explore, namely closing the loop through waste and water recovery. Because when we do agriculture in urban settings where people are right on top of what we do, there are things that we can't do, okay? There are safety issues, there are, pesticides, water runoff, but there is also an upside. It's not just how do we mitigate against the problems, but there's also an upside. Turns out urban ag can make a real contribution to water management, right? Because if we implement green roofs, green walls, add permeable surfaces where we used to have blacktop, then we actually help manage the stormwater runoff in cities. And so there is a real important connection in terms of urban agriculture and the resilience of urban spaces. And so we're actually building those, and maybe we can roll the slides again so you can get a little bit of an impression. We had, these are the 4 components of the food hubs. And then we have some examples on our Van Ness campus. This is one of the green roofs and a hydroponic system up on a greenhouse on a roof. This is our farm in Ward 5, where we have an aquaponic, a hydroponic system, and we're installing now a native plants nursery. And some of you were last night at East Capitol Urban Farm at the corner of Southern Avenue and East Capitol, where we also have an aquaponic system, a lot of community gardens. And so there's both a commercial component, but also a hobby component to these food hubs.
Great. Well, I hope some of you made the event last night. I didn't because I was so busy getting ready for today, but I thank you for hosting that and inviting people out to see.
We had a great turnout.
We had a great turnout. That's great.
Yeah.
So I have a question for each of you guys. I just want to know, where'd you grow up? Rural, urban, or suburban? Where'd you grow up, Deb?
Small town Bellingham that's now greater than 50,000. When I was growing up, it was 25,000. It's now 85,000.
Wow. Michael?
I was born in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up just outside it in the near suburb.
Sabine?
I grew up just north of Stuttgart, Germany. And so a very interesting community, farming community originally that had sort of become part of Stuttgart's larger metropolitan area. And so, you know, having grown up and went to ag school in Germany as well, in a country where agriculture is much, much smaller scale than in this country. So this mingling of spaces, peri-urban and urban spaces where food production is actually a viable option is sort of like second nature to me.
And again, I grew up in a very small town, though it was the county seat, and we were very proud because we had the courthouse. Those of you from rural America will know that kind of thing. So one last question for my panelists, and then we'll move on with the day. As you're listening to all the different presentations across the day, and by the way, all these slides we'll make available on the GW Food Institute website, so don't panic writing everything down. We will make sure that that's all accessible to you at some point. You know, as you're thinking through the day and you're listening to all these presentations, like what's kind of a core question that you're going to have in your head? Is there something that you're really looking for an answer to? I mean, I don't even think the four of us would agree on everything. This is also new. I think that having Senator Debbie Stabenow introduce her legislation this week is a milestone, and we're really grateful for her leadership in this area. Things are moving. But there's so much unknown. What's in your head? Who's got a question that's going to be up there?
I do, because this is such a germinal event, pardon the pun, but we are attempting to figure out how to raise the urban agriculture policy debate into the next farm bill. So I'm looking for ideas and intersections to kind of build a broader coalition, looking for the possibilities, the levers we can pull, that we can gather a broader base of support around whatever the key policy issues are that we can, in fact, create not necessarily a consensus, but a majority of people who will support the integration of urban into the next farm bill.
Michael, Sabine?
Yeah, so one of the questions I've had for a long time now, and I've had a lot of discussions with friends of mine that are embedded in this whole world, is how do we ensure that on the one hand, we really, I'm just going to say, solve the issue of food justice and food security in our urban neighborhoods throughout the country? And how do we ensure that there is enough food being grown that is nutritious and healthy? I absolutely agree with you on that. For these people to have a sufficient amount, so that we actually do get to scale where food sovereignty, food justice, and food security blend with the scaling of enough food for people to have a healthy diet on a daily basis.
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled that this is a topic, right? Because it's being the only exclusively urban land grant, even as recent as 5 years ago, I would on occasion call up the USDA or NIFA and say, excuse me, where are we in this RFP? Because urban wasn't even mentioned, right? So it's a very recent occurrence, and I'm just thrilled with that. But there are a lot of questions that remain. One of them to me is, how do we support the economic, the commercial viability of urban agriculture? Because, one of the things we've just sort of peripherally touched on is these same neighborhoods that have food security issues are also neighborhoods that have very high unemployment. And so there's job creation issues as well. And so we've got to really stop looking at urban agriculture as only a hobby or only an NGO space. And so how can we really support making it a commercially viable space? And in terms of food security, you know, I think there is plenty for all of us, because even a successful, scalable urban agriculture still needs peri-urban and rural spaces. Because if we're going to add another 2 billion people to this planet, which is sort of the trajectory we're on, then we all need to scale up, not just rural and peri-urban, but there has to be a place for urban agriculture in that food security solution.
Excellent. And my question on my mind today is I'll be listening very carefully to everyone's ideas. And at the end of the day, the four of us will come back on stage and talk about a process moving forward. How do I collect all the good ideas that people are sharing throughout the course of the day and put it in some usable form for members of Congress and for leaders in the executive branch so that they can act on it? There's a lot of opportunity. So thank you very much. We'll get off stage and we'll get on moving.
Thank you.
Thanks.